The bells of St. Cuthbert's stopped ringing at precisely 12 minutes past midnight, their final note thinning into the cold Highland air like a held breath, released too late. Hamish Macbeth lingered at the edge of the kirkyard as the last parishioners drifted away from midnight mass, their murmured blessings dissolving into the dark. Snow had begun to fall again, light indecisive flakes that refused to settle, leaving the ground looking clean in a way that made Hamish uneasy. Clean ground hid things. He was turning his collar up against the wind when the shout came from the vestry door, sharp and wrong, against the quiet reverence of the hour. Father Angus's voice cracked, as if it had been pulled apart by the frost. Hamish reached the door just as the priest staggered back, his face pale, one hand lifted as though warding off a vision that might follow him out. Inside the vestry the lamps still burned. Their glow revealed a small, orderly room, coats hung neatly, hymnals stacked with care, the collection box locked and untouched. And on the narrow bench beneath the window lay the body of Ewan Campbell, the village beadle, his hands folded across his chest as if someone had thoughtfully arranged him for a final viewing. His eyes were open, reflecting the lamplight with a dull, accusing sheen. There was no blood, no sign of struggle. The window was latched from the inside, its glass intact, rimmed with frost that showed no disturbance. The door through which Father Angus had entered was the only entrance, and it opened inward. Hamish noted all this without comment, letting the details settle in his mind like the snow outside that pretended to be harmless. "What time did you last see him?" Hamish asked gently. Father Angus swallowed. "Just before the service. He said he'd forgotten his scarf and would fetch it from here." "That was 11:30. Hamish glanced at the wall clock. Midnight 21. Less than an hour, then, in a room that had been full of quiet and light, surrounded by a church packed with people singing carols loud enough to wake the dead. Ewan Campbell had been killed without a sound. Hamish crouched beside the bench. Ewan's lips were faintly blue, his skin waxen. A quick touch told Hamish what he already suspected, cold beyond what the night alone could do. His gaze moved to Ewan's neck, to the faintest mark beneath the collar. No bruise, not quite a scratch. It could have been nothing. Or it could have been everything. On the floor beneath the bench lay a single object, positioned with peculiar care, a sprig of holly, glossy leaves unbroken, 3 red berries still clinging stubbornly to the stem. Hamish frowned. Holly grew wild enough around Loch Dhu, but this sprig had been cut clean, not torn, and it had no reason to be here at all. "Did he bring that with him?" Hamish asked. Father Angus shook his head slowly. "I've never seen Ewan carry holly in his life. He hated the stuff, said it reminded him of funerals." Hamish straightened, his bones protesting softly. Outside, the last of the congregation had gone, the village settling into its Christmas Eve silence. Too many people, too little time, and not a single one who could explain how a man had died in a locked room without so much as a raised voice. He tested the window latch again, harder this time, then examined the sill. No snow disturbed, no footprints below. Whoever had done this hadn't come or gone that way. The door then, but it had been in Father Angus's sight the entire evening, with altar boys and choir members passing back and forth in a steady stream. Hamish's eyes returned to the holly. An odd choice for a murderer in a hurry, unless it wasn't a choice at all, unless it was meant to be seen. He covered Ewan's face gently with his scarf, the one the man had come back for and never reclaimed. Outside the bells gave a final wind-shaken tremor, as if the church itself were uneasy about what it had just witnessed. Hamish stepped into the snow, already feeling the weight of a crime that was either absurdly simple or carefully impossible, and knowing from long experience that in Loch Dhu, the truth was never where it first appeared to be. Hamish Macbeth had learned long ago that the worst thing you could do at the start of an investigation was rush to look official. He stood back while the doctor from Strathbane, red-nosed and irritable from being dragged out after midnight mass, performed his brief muttered examination. The constables, young lads borrowed for the night, hovered uncertainly, stamping their feet against the cold and whispering guesses that sounded clever only because no one had challenged them yet. "Heart," the doctor pronounced at last, snapping his bag shut, or something close enough. "Man his age, cold night, excitement of the service, happens all the time." Hamish nodded politely, though his eyes never left the body. "And the mark on his neck?" The doctor paused, annoyed. He leaned closer, peered, then shrugged. Could be pressure from his collar, or a fold in the skin. Nothing I'd swear to. Hamish let that rest. The law, he knew, would take the doctor's word and be glad of it. A natural death at Christmas was a blessing of sorts. Tidy, comforting, easily filed away. But Hamish had lived in Loch Dhu too long to trust tidy things. Tidy things were usually arranged. When the body was lifted, carefully and with more reverence than efficiency, Hamish stepped forward at once. The bench beneath Ewan Campbell was bare now, but the shape of him lingered in the slightly flattened cushion, a faint impression like memory itself. Hamish crouched again, this time alone, and examined the floor where the holly had lain. No scuff marks, no sign it had fallen by accident. Someone had placed it there, then straightened it. Funny, said one of the constables, peering over Hamish's shoulder. Christmas decoration, maybe? Hamish looked up slowly. Not in here. Father Angus doesn't allow greenery in the vestry. Says it sheds. The lad flushed and stepped back. Hamish rose, rolling the holly sprig between his fingers. Fresh cut, no wilting. Whoever had brought it in hadn't done so hours earlier. It had been carried here close to the time of Ewan's death. Outside, a handful of villagers had gathered despite the cold, drawn by curiosity stronger than piety. Hamish moved among them with the ease of a man who belonged nowhere and everywhere at once. He listened more than he spoke. Listening always paid better. Mrs. McLean dabbed her eyes and said Ewan had seemed right as rain during the second hymn. Young Archie Fraser swore he'd seen Ewan step out early, though when pressed he couldn't quite say how early. And then there was Morag Grant, the florist, standing stiff-backed with he. Our arms crossed too tightly over her coat. Hamish noticed her because she did not look at the church door, not once. Cold night for waiting, Hamish said mildly, stopping beside her. Aye, Morag replied too quickly. I should be home. Busy time for you, Hamish went on. Holly and wreaths, all that. Her mouth tightened. I don't sell holly sprigs loose, only in arrangements. Hamish smiled faintly. I didn't ask if you did. She coloured, then looked away toward the dark line of trees beyond the kirkyard. Everyone has holly this time of year. Not Ewan Campbell, Hamish said. He disliked it. Morag's shoulders twitched. I wouldn't know about that. Hamish let her go, the unease she carried trailing after her like a scent. Deception, he thought, was rarely clever. It was usually just badly timed honesty. Back inside, the vestry felt emptier now, stripped of its grim purpose. Hamish examined the coat hooks, noting that one held Ewan's hat but not his coat. The coat lay folded on the chair, pockets unturned. A man fetching a forgotten scarf would not remove his coat unless he meant to stay, or unless someone had asked him to. Hamish tried the door again, then the window, then stood very still, listening. From here he could hear the faint echo of the wind moving through the church proper, the whisper of air through stone. During the service, the sound of voices and organ would have drowned anything softer than a shout, a hand over a mouth, a brief struggle carefully controlled. It would not have taken long. The holly sprig rested on the table now, a bright, accusing green against the dark wood. Hamish stared at it, thinking of Morag's shop, of fresh cuts made late at night, of a man who hated reminders of funerals and yet had been sent off with one all the same. Outside, snow finally began to settle in earnest, softening the world and disguising its edges. Hamish pulled his collar up again and felt the familiar, unwelcome certainty take hold. Whatever the doctor said, Ewan Campbell had not died alone, and the person who had seen to that was already walking free in the village, counting on Christmas kindness and routine to keep inconvenient questions at bay. The next morning the village of Loch Dhu woke under a soft white blanket, and Hamish Macbeth set about questioning those who had been at midnight mass. The church had emptied, leaving behind the faint scent of candles and polished wood, but the memory of Ewan Campbell's body hung in the air like a persistent fog. Hamish started with Father Angus, whose relief at the morning sun was palpable, though it did little to steady his nervous hands. "Tell me exactly what you saw," Hamish said, leaning against the altar rail as the priest fidgeted with his cufflinks. "From the moment you noticed Ewan was missing until you found him." Father Angus swallowed and spoke quickly, perhaps too quickly. I went to fetch the vestry key after the hymn. The altar boys were still arranging candles. I opened the door and—" His voice faltered, then resumed, and he was there. "I swear, Hamish, he was lying so still I thought he was asleep." Hamish's eyes lingered on the priest's hands, fidgeting or guilt, he wasn't yet sure. "No one else could have entered?" I don't think so. Not without me noticing." Outside, Hamish moved down the snow-covered street toward the other villagers. The first he approached was young Archie Fraser, who had been hovering near the church door that night, full of chatter and nerves. "I saw Ewan go into the vestry," Archie said, arms flailing. "Or maybe he was leaving. I dunno, I think. No, I know I saw him moving." Hamish raised an eyebrow. "Which way?" Archie's face scrunched. "I can't remember. Everyone was singing and the organ, oh, it was loud." Hamish nodded. Dead slowly. Not a lie exactly, but a carefully chosen vagueness. He filed it away. Morag Grant, the florist, had arrived, just as the snow began in earnest, her cheeks flushed from cold or nerves. "I only came to see Father Angus about the wreaths," she said, voice clipped. "I didn't see anything unusual. Everyone was in the church." Her eyes flicked toward the vestry, then away, too quickly to be casual. "You mentioned yesterday you don't sell holly loose," Hamish said, folding his notebook. "Yet a holly sprig was left in the vestry with Ewan. How might that have come to be?" Her face tightened. "I don't know. Perhaps someone borrowed it from a display. I didn't—" She stopped, a faint tremor in her voice betraying her. Hamish noted it carefully. She wasn't lying outright, but she was uncomfortable with the suggestion, and that meant something. He moved on to Donald MacLeod, the church warden, a man whose face had been drawn tight with worry the night before. "I was outside clearing the steps. Didn't see anything strange," Donald said. His gaze darted toward the kirkyard, where snow had begun to cover footprints. All of Loch Dhu was singing inside. How could anyone do anything unnoticed? Bah! Hamish didn't answer immediately. He observed Donald's boots, clean, except for faint traces of snow, suggesting someone had brushed past recently. He noted it, storing it away like a key that might fit later. Back inside the vestry, Hamish lingered. He could still see the faint dusting of frost along the window edges, and the slight indentation where the coat had been folded. Everything pointed to someone very careful, very deliberate. He wondered at the contrasts in the villagers' accounts. Father Angus too quick to absolve himself, Archie too uncertain to be useful, Morag too tense to be innocent, Donald too defensive to be straightforward. A pattern was emerging, not of what had happened, but of what each person wanted him to believe had happened. Hamish allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Truth in Loch Dhu, as ever, was a fragile thing, hidden beneath layers of habit, fear, and the polite fiction everyone preferred to maintain. He would have to tease it out carefully, word by word, gesture by gesture. The snow deepened outside, muffling the village, but it could not silence the subtle signs that Hamish noticed: a hesitant glance, a foot shuffled behind a chair, a voice just slightly off-pitch when it should have been calm. Each of these fragments promised a revelation, though their meaning was still blurred. Hamish straightened, sensing the rhythm of deception beginning to reveal itself. Someone in the village had taken advantage of the darkness, the noise, and the trust of their neighbours, and Hamish Macbeth intended to find out exactly who. Hamish Macbeth spent the next hours walking the quiet streets of Loch Dhu, replaying each fragment of conversation in his mind like a pianist rehearsing a difficult passage. Everyone had a reason, he realised, and none of the reasons were simple. Ewan Campbell had been a man of small authority and large grudges, enforcing rules, collecting rents, and managing parish funds. The very ordinariness of his duties had made him a thorn in more than one side. He started with Father Angus. The priest had been cordial, almost anxious to exonerate himself, but Hamish remembered the subtle tension in his hands, and the way he had flinched at the mention of the holly. Father Angus had been administering the parish for decades, and could be sensitive to criticism, especially regarding finances or appearances. A complaint about a missing donation or a mismanaged fund might seem trivial to an outsider, but in the quiet of the kirk it could fester. Hamish made a note: no overt threat, but opportunity and subtle friction. Both present. Morag Grant's nervousness suggested a different kind of motive, She ran a modest shop, dependent on seasonal sales, and there were whispers she had been undercut by competitors recently. Ewan had been meticulous, and perhaps she feared he had disapproved of her shop's arrangements or questioned her accounts. She had avoided his gaze during questioning, and the holly sprig, freshly cut, deliberately placed, could have been a silent rebuke or a warning, one meant to be seen but not directly acknowledged. Hamish weighed it carefully. Morag's motive was emotional rather than calculated, though that did not make it less dangerous. Donald MacLeod was harder to read. The warden had been defensive, proud of his oversight of the church and its events. Pride could harden into resentment, and Hamish recalled faint rumours of disputes over authority, disagreements in the vestry committee that occasionally erupted behind closed doors. Donald's alibi, that he had been outside clearing snow, was plausible, but the slight smudge of snow on his boots suggested movement in places he hadn't claimed. Pride, jealousy, and opportunity all intertwined, leaving Hamish with a complicated pattern that was far from decisive. Then young Archie Fraser, seemingly innocent and scatterbrained, could be more involved than he appeared. Hamish considered the boy's eagerness to speak, his scattered memory of time and place. Sometimes fear or guilt masked itself as innocence. Archie had been close enough to witness details, and while a child's confusion was expected, Hamish knew better than to ignore small inconsistencies. Children, like snowdrifts, often concealed more than they revealed. Hamish returned to the vestry as the morning sun began to pale against the drifting snow, noticing the faint outline of footprints near the window and bench. He crouched and traced them carefully, noting that they were irregular, suggesting someone had lingered, perhaps debating whether to stay or leave. Each suspect he had questioned might have had a reason to be there, yet none had fully accounted for their movements during the crucial minutes. The layers of motive were tangled, fear, jealousy, pride, and perhaps greed coiled around one another in a silent spiral. He remembered Ewan Campbell himself, exacting, principled, unyielding in matters both small and large. He had no shortage of people who wished to see him humbled or gone, each for their own quiet grievances. Some grudges were petty, some simmered over years. The challenge was to separate those who nursed harmless resentments from those capable of acting on them. Motive alone was a spark, opportunity and method were the tinder. Hamish needed to find where they converged. The snow outside deepened, muffling sound and hiding footprints, as though the village itself conspired to cloak its secrets. Hamish, however, had a growing sense of the rhythm behind the chaos, the contradictions he had noted, the too quick words, the too careful gestures, the oddly placed holly, were not random. They were messages, deliberate or inadvertent, left behind by someone who thought they had controlled the narrative. Hamish pressed a gloved hand to the windowsill, feeling the faint chill seep through. Each suspect's alibi, each carefully concealed emotion, each seemingly minor clue now began to form a lattice. He would not yet name a culprit, but the web was taking shape. And in Loch Dhu, Hamish knew, every web eventually betrayed its spinner. Hamish Macbeth had been pacing the vestry floor for more than an hour when Constable Neil Stewart returned, breathless, holding a small, folded piece of paper. "Found this in Ewan Campbell's coat pocket," he announced. "Looks like a note. Could be something important." Hamish took it, careful not to crease it further. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, almost frantic, but the message was simple. "Meet me tonight. Midnight. Vestry. Alone." The room seemed to pause. Outside, the wind rustled the snow-dusted eaves, and for a moment even the faint echo of the village felt suspended. Hamish read and reread the note. Someone had lured Ewan intentionally. That much was clear. The constables immediately leapt to action, imagining the case solved. "See," one said, excitement in his voice. "It points straight to someone. They knew Ewan would be there." Father Angus wrung his hands, looking relieved. "At last, some clarity. Surely we can—" Hamish's brow furrowed. "Slow down," he said gently. "This is a clue, yes, but it tells us only part of the story. It explains his presence, not his death. Someone wrote this note, but why would they assume he'd be alone? And why the holly? Despite his caution, the village buzzed with a premature triumph. Gossip spread like wildfire, a note, proof of premeditation, a seeming motive. In the kirk, whispers of suspicion focused on Morag Grant, given her known access to Holly and proximity to the church. The authorities seemed eager to pin blame on the florist, convinced that a fresh-cut sprig and a timed meeting were all the evidence they needed. Hamish, however, could not shake the feeling that they were celebrating a false victory. The note explained the where and when, but nothing about the how. Ewan had been killed quietly, without struggle, and the door had remained locked from the inside. The simplest explanation, the one the villagers clung to, ignored too many small anomalies, footprints that didn't match any alibi, the faint smudge on Donald MacLeod's boots, the subtle evasion in Morag's eyes, and the disjointed recollections from Archie. Someone had planned carefully, then waited for chaos, the singing, the snow, the midnight service, to mask their actions. Hamish examined the note again. The paper was ordinary, the ink common. Nothing about it tied it to Morag or anyone else conclusively. It was a piece of the puzzle, not the picture itself. He folded it slowly and slipped it into his coat pocket. The writer had assumed control, but they had underestimated the village's memory, the way small details lingered longer than grand gestures. By midday, the constables had interviewed Morag with renewed urgency. They pressed her about the note, the Holly, her movements that night. Morag's composure wavered only briefly, and Hamish observed carefully a twitch of her lips, a slight avoidance of direct eye contact, yet no overt confession. She had answers, perhaps, but the truth was not one she would offer lightly. Hamish left the church with a quiet certainty. The note had drawn a line through the suspects, but it had not pierced the veil of reality. The real culprit was still hidden, likely watching the unfolding chaos with the satisfaction of a hunter whose prey believed itself safe. The false sense of closure had a smell to it, faint and acrid, and Hamish's instincts bristled. He walked through the snow toward the village centre, ears alert to footsteps, voices, anything that might betray the hidden player still in motion. Even as the villagers whispered of solved mysteries and exonerated neighbours, Hamish felt the threads of deception tugging in directions no one had yet considered. The holly sprig, the carefully folded coat, the note, all elements of a story someone wanted told in a particular way. And Hamish, as always, knew that stories were rarely as simple as they seemed. The victory the village celebrated was theirs alone. The truth, he suspected, was still very much at large, and Ewan Campbell's murderer had not yet made their final move. Hamish paused at the edge of the kirkyard, watching. The sun glint off the snow, and the shadows lengthen across the gravestones. Somewhere, someone smiled behind a mask of innocence, believing the game was theirs. But Hamish Macbeth had a different understanding. In Lochdu, patience and attention to the smallest detail often outmatched bold, hasty action. The case was far from closed. Hamish Macbeth returned to his small office above the village shop, the snow crunching under his boots as he walked. The false sense of victory had settled like a layer of frost over Lochdu, but his mind refused to thaw into complacency. He spread the notes he had collected across the table, each scribbled alibi, each evasive glance, each fragment of overheard conversation, and stared at them in silence. Something was missing. Something old, buried in the village's memory, was whispering beneath the chatter of the present. He recalled an incident from years ago, long before the current church committee had taken shape. Ewan Campbell had been involved in a dispute over the management of parish lands, a small but heated affair that had left several villagers quietly embittered. Hamish remembered the heated argument between Donald MacLeod and Ewan, the way Morag Grant had been called in to supply flowers for a reconciliatory service afterward. At the time it had seemed trivial, petty grievances of a sleepy Highland village, but now, in the context of the holly, the note, and the locked vestry, it took on a different significance. He pulled out a folder from the back of his desk, the one containing the village's old reports, complaints, and minor disputes. Among them was a complaint filed by Father Angus against Ewan, regarding funds misallocated to the parish bazaar several years prior. The report noted that Morag Grant had supplied arrangements for the bazaar, and a minor discrepancy in her accounts had been quietly smoothed over. Hamish. H's eyes narrowed. The holly sprig, freshly cut and placed with deliberate care, suddenly seemed less like a random flourish, and more like a message recalling a specific event, a grievance perhaps, never fully settled. He thought about Donald MacLeod, who had been unusually defensive when questioned. The old record mentioned him as a committee member at that time, insisting that Ewan had overstepped his authority. A pattern emerged: old tensions, unspoken resentments, and a network of grudges tied to Ewan's meticulousness and the village's quiet hierarchy. What had seemed like isolated motives now converged, suggesting collaboration, or at least shared interests, among those involved. Hamish glanced again at the note: "Meet me tonight, midnight, vestry, alone." He realized the note was both literal and symbolic. Whoever had written it had not just orchestrated a meeting, they had invoked a shared memory of control, authority, and the petty but lingering injustices of the past. This was not a simple crime of opportunity. It was carefully rooted in history, exploiting old fractures in relationships that had never healed. He revisited Morag in his mind, the slight twitch, the avoidance of eye contact, and Donald, with the smudge on his boots and the defensive stance. Even Father Angus, anxious to be absolved and quick to redirect blame, fit into this pattern. Ewan's death had not been the result of a single person's grudge. It was the culmination of years of subtle manipulations, of grudges left to fester, of quiet alliances and unspoken resentments. Hamish closed his eyes briefly, letting the connections form a lattice. The holly sprig was a calling card, but not the sort he had first suspected. It was meant to signal to someone else, someone who would recognize the significance, who understood the history, the old grievances. The crime stretched back years, a tapestry woven, with quiet disputes, carefully forgotten slights, and the small, persistent annoyances that could fester into darker acts. He opened his eyes and looked at the snow through the office window, the village glittering deceptively peaceful. The past had been silent for years, but it had not been gone. It had only waited, and now it had spoken through the death of Ewan Campbell. Hamish felt the familiar stir of clarity, the point where patterns emerge from chaos, where connections overlooked by others become unavoidable truths. The criminal was still moving unseen among them, but Hamish now knew the frame. He understood the past that had been exploited, the grudges that had been leveraged, and the people who had shared its weight. The investigation was no longer merely about finding someone at the vestry at midnight. It was about unravelling a web of old resentments and careful planning, about understanding that in Loch Dhu, the present could never be separated from the past. And as he stepped back into the snow to resume his silent observations, Hamish Macbeth sensed that the first real threads of the true culprit were beginning to emerge, ready to be pulled. Hamish Macbeth returned to the church late that afternoon, when the snow had softened into slush along the village paths, and the low winter sun cast long shadows through the kirk windows. He walked slowly, deliberately, as if the building itself might whisper secrets if treated with patience. He had a plan, unconventional but rooted in experience. Sometimes the smallest, most unexpected test could make people reveal what they were trying hardest to conceal. He gathered the few remaining villagers in the vestry under the pretense of reconstructing the events of midnight mass. His tone was casual, almost conversational, but every word was chosen to provoke subtle reactions. He held up the holly sprig, the fresh, glossy leaves and stubborn berries still vivid in the lamplight. "Curious thing," he said lightly. "A sprig of holly in the vestry. Someone wanted it noticed. But the strangest part isn't the choice of plant. It's what it tells us about the person who brought it here. They knew who would recognize it, and who would care." He let the words hang in the air and observed the villagers carefully. Father Angus shifted, smoothing his cuff, eyes flicking away. Archie Fraser fidgeted with his scarf, but seemed too young to connect meaning with intent. Donald MacLeod crossed his arms, expression tight, jaw tense. Morag Grant, however, betrayed the smallest hint of hesitation, a micro-expression so fleeting most would miss it. Her fingers twitched against the side of her coat as if the sprig had pricked something deeper than curiosity. Hamish continued, choosing his words to unsettle without accusation. Now this sprig is fresh cut, not long in the shop, not long in anyone's hand, really. Whoever brought it here knew it would be seen, knew it would draw attention. That takes planning. A knowledge bar. Orig's eyes flicked toward him. The tiniest spark of recognition, or perhaps fear. Hamish followed the line of her gaze, noting how she seemed to weigh her words even before speaking. Planning, yes, Hamish said softly. But planning for what? A gift? A warning? Or a message? He paused. Suppose you were going to warn someone, how would you do it without anyone else noticing? Or suppose you wanted to remind someone of something they'd rather forget. What then? Orig shifted in her boots, her voice a fraction too high when she finally answered. I don't know. I didn't do anything with Holly. I sell arrangements. That's all, bruh. Hamish smiled faintly, not unkindly. Of course. But imagine you had access. Imagine you had a reason to be in the vestry, and you wanted to make your presence known without being seen. Wouldn't a small, symbolic object do the trick? Something meaningful to the right person? Her composure cracked ever so slightly. The hand that had been resting at her side twitched toward the holly sprig on the table. I don't know what you mean, she said, voice tight. Hamish leaned closer, lowering his tone. I mean that someone is trying to tell us something, or perhaps mislead us. Only the person who truly understands the significance would react. He let a beat pass, then added casually, and reactions are telling things, aren't they? Her shoulders slumped imperceptibly, the first sign of genuine tension that Hamish had seen. The micro-expression vanished as quickly as it appeared, but it was enough. He had seen the crack in her carefully maintained facade. Morag was hiding something, and it was not just fear of accusation. It was the echo of a memory, a connection to the past grievance, something personal that had been triggered by the holly. Hamish straightened, letting the moment settle. Thank you, he said quietly, as if acknowledging a confession she hadn't spoken aloud. Sometimes it's not what people say, but what they cannot stop themselves from revealing. Outside, the wind whispered against the kirk walls, carrying with it the faint sound of distant bells marking the hour. Hamish watched Morag, noting her tension, her avoidance of eye contact, the way her hands could not remain still. The unconventional clue, her reaction, the tiny involuntary gestures, the way she had betrayed herself under gentle pressure, had given him more than any notebook or witness statement could. He knew now that the path forward lay not in the obvious evidence, not in the note or the holly alone, but in the subtleties, the unguarded movements and fleeting expressions. The real culprit, or at least the person who had orchestrated the holly and exploited old grudges, was still in play, but Hamish Macbeth had caught the first glimpse of their shadow, and that shadow had just moved. Hamish Macbeth returned to the vestry the following morning, determined to review every scrap of evidence, every footprint, every whispered recollection, before the village's premature confidence hardened into collective certainty. But the first thing he noticed made his stomach tighten. The holly sprig, carefully placed the day before and observed under his own hand, was gone. The table was bare. The glossy leaves and bright berries vanished without a trace. He crouched, examining the surface for any sign of disturbance. There was nothing, no fragments of leaves, no smudge of resin, no indication it had fallen. Someone had removed it deliberately, taking the most telling clue from the scene before he could fully analyze it. Hamish's jaw tightened. Outside, the snow had begun to melt into a slushy grey, masking tracks and footprints in the streets, but he had a clear memory of the pattern of movement yesterday. Whoever had taken the holly had done so with knowledge of its significance, and likely with knowledge of his own investigation. The message, carefully constructed, had been erased before it could be fully read. He pulled on his coat and moved quickly through the village, stopping first at Morag Grant's shop. The florist stood behind the counter arranging wreaths, her composure seemingly intact, but Hamish noticed the faintest tremor in her hands. "You saw the holly," he said quietly, leaning against the doorway. "Yesterday, here in the vestry. And today it's gone. What do you know of that?" Morag's face betrayed nothing. "I don't know anything. I was here all morning, arranging wreaths. People must have moved it. Perhaps a visitor, a curious child. Hamish raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. A visitor who knew exactly where to look and which clue to remove. She faltered ever so slightly, a blink too long, a hesitation too sharp. He made a mental note. Another crack, a subtle reaction that betrayed more than words. But he could not accuse yet. Whoever had taken the sprig was clever, careful, and had likely anticipated his attention. He retraced his steps to the vestry, considering each person with access. Father Angus, who had the key, Donald MacLeod, often responsible for locking and opening, the choir boys, children whose curiosity often outpaced caution, and Morag, whose connection to the holly and to past grievances could not be dismissed, but it was the precision of the removal that concerned him. This was no hasty act. It was deliberate, calculated, meant to interfere with the investigation. Hamish returned to the table where the sprig had rested, examining it as though it might leave a residual memory on the wood. The polish was immaculate, the surface cold. He tapped it lightly with his gloved finger, imagining the sequence: arrival, removal, exit, all unseen, unchallenged. He realized that the person responsible had not only anticipated the investigation but had acted to control its narrative, to bury the truth before it could be uncovered. The constables arrived, breathless and eager. "Sir, the sprig. Someone must have taken it. What do we do?" Hamish nodded slowly. "We do what we always do. Watch. Observe. The person who would go to such lengths will make another move, and when they do, we will notice it." As he stepped outside, the village seemed deceptively quiet, the snow masking footsteps, erasing paths, disguising movement. Trust had become fragile. Each glance, each casual remark might be a deliberate misdirection. Hamish knew now that the investigation had entered a more dangerous phase. The removal of the holly was a signal. Someone close to the truth was aware of his progress, and they would not hesitate to act again to protect themselves. Hamish's eyes swept the streets, landing briefly on the flicker of movement behind a curtained window, the subtle shift of a figure disappearing down a narrow alley, and the faint, lingering scent of pine from the florist's shop. Every detail mattered, every reaction a potential clue. The missing holly sprig had removed one tangible piece of the puzzle, but in its absence Hamish saw something more valuable: the pattern of fear, calculation, and anticipation left behind by the person who had taken it. The stakes had risen, and the village's complacency was a shield for the real culprit. Hamish Macbeth tightened his coat collar and set off through the slushy streets, every sense alert. The investigation was no longer just about discovering who had killed Ewan Campbell. It was about outwitting someone who was actively trying to bury the truth, and Hamish knew that in Loch Dhu, patience, attention, and timing would be his only weapons against a shadow that was already moving among them. The afternoon had begun to darken, the weak winter sun sinking low behind the hills, when a sharp knock rattled Hamish Macbeth's office door. He had been tracing mental maps of movement and opportunity, replaying the vanished holly sprig and the subtle reactions he had observed, when Constable Neil Stewart burst in, pale and breathless. "Sir, it's the MacLeod farm. Something's happened," Neil stammered, clutching his cap. "Donald, he's gone. No one knows where." Hamish felt a familiar chill, the cold edge of danger slicing through the calculated calm he usually maintained. "Gone?" he asked. "What do you mean, vanished?" Neil said. "We went to check his house, in case he knew something about the sprig or the note, but the door was unlocked. No sign of a struggle. His chair was tipped, the fire still burning, and—" Neil faltered. His boots aren't there." Hamish grabbed his coat and set off immediately, boots crunching through the slush-sodden streets. The MacLeod house sat at the edge of the village, small and sturdy, smoke curling lazily from the chimney. Inside, the chaos was subtle but undeniable. A chair tipped near the hearth, books slightly displaced on the shelf, a faint smear on the polished floorboards. Whoever had entered had moved carefully but had left evidence in its wake. E noticed immediately that Donald's coat was missing, though his hat remained, and that the boots he had worn the night of midnight mass were gone. The absence was deliberate. Hamish felt the rhythm of it in his bones. Someone had come, taken what mattered most, and vanished without alerting anyone. This was not theft. It was a message, a warning, a calculated disruption designed to unsettle the investigation and assert control. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of smoke from the hearth and faintly of pine, a trace of Morag's shop. Hamish's mind traced back through his observations, connecting subtle threads. Morag's hesitation, the missing holly, the note, the vanishing boots. Someone was orchestrating events with precision, keeping the villagers distracted while moving pieces into place. He returned to the village streets, alert to every movement, every shadow. The thought struck him sharply. This was no longer a single murder case. The villain was active, mobile, and willing to manipulate or harm anyone who threatened exposure. If Donald had been taken, or worse, the next target could be anyone, perhaps even Hamish himself. As he approached the church, a movement in the alleyway caught his eye, a fleeting silhouette slipping behind the stone wall. Hamish paused, glancing sharply. The figure had disappeared before he could call out, but the instinct was unmistakable. He was being watched, and the observer knew the rhythm of his movements. The game had escalated. He retraced his steps to the vestry, checking the layout, the doors, the windows, and the small spaces where a quick exit might be made. Nothing had been disturbed since the holly sprig was taken, yet the sequence of events now included not just a missing clue, but a missing man. Whoever controlled this was several steps ahead, manipulating both evidence and perception. Hamish took a deep breath and considered the implications. The motive was no longer merely revenge or old grievances. It was control, the ability to dictate the pace and perception of the investigation. The previous clues, the note, the holly, the reactions, had all been moves in a larger, deliberate strategy to stay hidden while guiding others' assumptions. The criminal was clever, patient, and ruthless. Night had fallen fully, and the village streets were dimly lit, each shadow potentially harbouring someone with intent. Hamish walked slowly, observing, testing the rhythm of the village. His mind worked through every scenario. Who would benefit from Donald's disappearance? Who had access and knowledge, and who could act without leaving obvious traces? The web of past grudges, careful planning, and subtle misdirection stretched taut, threatening to snap in unpredictable ways. Hamish knew, with a certainty born of long experience, that the next hours would be crucial. This was no longer simply about solving Ewan Campbell's death. It was about preventing further harm, about outthinking an adversary who had turned the investigation into a trap. Every step, every observation, every instinctive reaction would count. The shadow behind the missing holly and the vanished warden was still moving, and Hamish Macbeth had to find it before it struck again. Hamish Macbeth spent the early hours of the evening walking the slushy streets of Loch Dhu, retracing every step he and the Vi. Lagers had taken over the past 2 days. The snow, once crisp and orderly, had begun to turn to grey slush, covering footprints and erasing obvious trails. Yet for Hamish, the absence of tracks mattered less than the minutiae, gestures, glances, small habits, and the faintest inconsistencies in stories repeated over and over. He returned to the vestry once more, standing alone amid the empty pews. The room smelled faintly of candle wax and polished wood. He examined the coat hooks, the table where the holly had been, the slightly tilted chair where Ewan's coat had rested. Nothing seemed dramatic, nothing screamed guilt, and yet, for the first time, a rhythm began to emerge from the chaos, subtle but unmistakable. It was the small things. The way Morag Grant's fingers trembled whenever the holly was mentioned, the slight smudge on Donald MacLeod's boots that didn't match any declared movements, the way Father Angus avoided looking at the vestry door, as though it held more than just a lock and a frame. The pieces had seemed scattered, insignificant, until Hamish allowed himself to step back and see them not as isolated facts, but as notes in a melody, each one leading to the next. Then it struck him. A comment Archie Fraser had made in passing. "I thought I saw someone putting the holly on the table," the boy had said, "but I didn't get a good look. They were moving fast." At the time, Hamish had filed it as childish uncertainty, but now he saw its significance. The holly had not just been a clue. It had been a deliberate signal, placed for a particular observer, and intended to provoke reactions. Its placement, its freshness, and even its subsequent removal were all part of a pattern of communication orchestrated by someone who understood the village and its inhabitants far better than anyone realized. Hamish closed his eyes, picturing the sequence of events, Ewan Race. Hiving the note, arriving at the vestry, the holly carefully positioned to elicit recognition or guilt, the removal of the sprig to disrupt the investigation, and the subsequent disappearance of Donald MacLeod. Each move had been calculated, each reaction predicted. The person behind it was clever, precise, and patient, someone who knew human nature as intimately as they knew the village itself. Tea wasn't just about who hated Ewan or who had grievances. It was about who could manipulate perceptions, direct suspicion, and orchestrate events in plain sight. Hamish's mind turned over the suspects again. Morag's connection to the holly was no longer just circumstantial. Her nervous reactions, her careful phrasing, and her unguarded gestures all fit the emerging rhythm. But she was not acting alone, and she had been responding to cues she understood from someone else. Then the small, almost forgotten details of past disputes, the old committee disagreements, and the minor irritations of village life now fell into place. The pattern revealed a network of motives intertwined with knowledge, opportunity, and psychological insight. The crimes were not impulsive. They were deliberate, layered, and orchestrated to create confusion while steering others toward false conclusions. Hamish walked to the vestry window, looking down at the darkened streets of Loch Dhu, the faint glow of lamplight reflecting off the slush. Every shadow seemed significant now, every movement potentially meaningful. The puzzle had been here all along, hiding in the ordinary, in habits and gestures that everyone had overlooked. What had seemed random, the holly, the note, the missing boots, was in fact part of a deliberate sequence, a signature of the person who had acted with patience and cunning. For the first time, Hamish felt the thrill of clarity. The chaos was no longer an impenetrable fog. The pattern, faint and elusive, was beginning to speak, and he could follow its voice. Each small, seemingly insignificant detail, the gestures, the comments, the objects, was a breadcrumb leading straight to the orchestrator of Ewan Campbell's death and the subsequent disappearance of Donald MacLeod. Hamish knew the next step would require careful timing. The pattern had revealed the skeleton of the truth, but the flesh, proof, confrontation, and perhaps danger, still needed to be drawn out. The village slept uneasily under the darkening sky, unaware that the key to the mystery had been in plain sight all along, waiting for someone patient enough, observant enough, and clever enough to see it, and Hamish Macbeth was that someone. Hamish Macbeth stayed late in the vestry that night, the church empty and silent except for the faint creak of floorboards and the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows. He had traced the pattern, noted the subtle reactions, and reconstructed the sequence of events with painstaking care. Yet the final question remained, why? Why had someone gone to such lengths to orchestrate Ewan Campbell's death, manipulate clues, and even disappear Donald MacLeod? The answer, he realized, lay not in the surface grievances or petty disputes, but in the hidden psychology of the perpetrator. Reviewed the old parish records again, focusing on connections others had dismissed as trivial. A comment in a meeting minutes caught his eye. Morag Grant had once argued vehemently with Ewan over the placement of a wreath at a ceremony honouring a deceased villager. She had been young, newly responsible for her shop, but her indignation had been noted, almost mockingly, in the official records. Ewan had dismissed her concerns without thought, but to Morag the slight had festered. It wasn't just anger or resentment. It was a wound to her sense of identity and autonomy. Miss. She thought back to her reactions, the flicker of unease at the mention of the holly, the tremor in her hands, the way she avoided direct eye contact. This was not fear of arrest. It was fear of exposure. The careful orchestration, the subtle manipulations, the staging of clues, all of it revealed a mind accustomed to control. Someone who derived satisfaction from crafting narratives, from shaping perception, and ultimately from asserting power over those who had once diminished her. But the revelation went deeper. Hamish remembered the vanished boots, the removed holly, the precise timing of Donald MacLeod's disappearance. Morag had not acted alone. She had been guided, perhaps influenced, by a deeper compulsion that went beyond vengeance or personal gain. Hamish's thoughts turned to the pattern of behaviour, the meticulous planning that suggested someone who found meaning in the control of others, someone who needed to manipulate events not just for outcomes, but for the psychological gratification of seeing their intentions executed flawlessly. He reconstructed the chain of events in his mind, the note to Ewan, written in haste but compelling, the placement of the holly, symbolically charged and deliberate, the removal of the sprig to mislead investigators, the disappearance of Donald MacLeod to escalate fear and uncertainty. Each step had been carefully choreographed, not merely to punish, but to test, to assert dominance, to satisfy an almost obsessive need for control. Shh! Mish realized the true motive was a combination of long-standing grievance and an obsessive compulsion. Morag Grant had been slighted repeatedly in small ways, dismissed, underestimated, and she had internalized those slights, turning them into a quiet obsession with influence and manipulation. Ewan's death was the culmination of years of simmering resentment, carefully executed to maximize both satisfaction and concealment. The vanished holly, once a simple clue, was in fact a symbol of that need, the perfect mixture of subtlety, message, and personal power. He also recognized the secondary purpose in the disappearance of Donald MacLeod. It was not simply to remove an obstacle, but to test the village, to observe reactions, to ensure that his or her manipulations were working as intended. The psychological depth of the crime was staggering. It was not greed, not revenge alone, but a need to orchestrate events, to see the invisible threads of influence pulling others like marionettes. Hamish's lips pressed together as he stood in the cold silence of the vestry, letting the understanding settle. He had seen cunning before, cleverness and misdirection, but this was a more intricate and intimate kind of malevolence. It came not from malice alone, but from the hidden architecture of a mind obsessed with control and subtle domination. Outside, the snow whispered softly against the windows, masking footsteps and erasing traces. Hamish knew the perpetrator remained in the village, confident in their manipulation, but he also knew that understanding the true motive, the psychological drive, was the key to predicting the next move. Morag Grant's crime had been years in gestation, and the depth of her obsession explained the lengths she had gone to, the careful orchestration, the vanished clues, and the escalating threats. Hamish stepped back into the slushy streets, mind alive with the connections, the threads of human obsession and ingenuity. The hidden motive had been revealed, a dangerous consuming need for control, layered over past grievances and nurtured into precision action. With this insight, Hamish understood not only who had acted, but why, and he knew that the final confrontation would require as much patience and psychological acumen as observation and deducti. The case was no longer merely about solving a murder, it was about confronting a mind that thrived in shadows, manipulation, and the power of hidden truths. Hamish Macbeth waited until the village had quieted, the streets slick with melting snow and shadows stretching long under the dim glow of the lamplights. He had pieced together the pattern, traced the motives, and reconstructed the psychological architecture behind Ewan Campbell's murder and Donald MacLeod's disappearance. Everything now led to one person, and Hamish knew that the final step required precision, patience, and the subtle pressure that would make the hidden cracks visible. He arranged a meeting in the vestry, under the pretense of reviewing the case with Morag Grant. The church was empty, the only sounds the occasional groan of settling wood and the distant drip of melting snow from the eaves. He had chosen the setting carefully, enclosed enough to prevent escape, public enough that a dramatic confrontation could unfold without sudden violence going unnoticed, and familiar enough to the suspect that it would not immediately trigger suspicion. Orrig entered hesitantly, her posture stiff, her eyes darting to the table where the holly had once been, now replaced with a small, innocuous sprig deliberately left by Hamish as bait. She spoke first, voice guarded. "I suppose this is about the events at the church," she said, the words clipped but careful. "Yes," Hamish replied calmly, gesturing to a chair opposite him. "I want to talk about the note, the holly, and everything that followed." You know why I called you here?" Her gaze flicked to the sprig on the table, a micro-expression of recognition, shock, fear, perhaps anticipation. Hamish let the moment stretch, watching her breathe, noting the slight tremor in her fingers, the way her eyes avoided his for more than an instant. "Morag," he said gently, "the pattern has been clear for some time now. The vanished Holly, Donald's disappearance, the manipulation of those around you, they weren't mistakes. They were deliberate. And you've been trying to control the narrative from the start." She stiffened, the first overt defensive posture. I don't know what you mean. I haven't done anything wrong." Her voice wavered slightly, betraying the careful composure she had maintained until now. Hamish leaned forward, keeping his tone even but pressing. "You orchestrated Ewan's death. You knew about past grievances. You used the note to lure him, the Holly to signal him and to elicit reactions. And you removed it when it suited you. You even tested the village with Donald's disappearance. The motive, your obsession with control, the need to assert yourself, the years of simmering resentment, explains everything." For a moment, Morag's face hardened, her jaw clenching. Then, almost imperceptibly, the facade began to crack. Her shoulders slumped slightly, her hands fidgeted with the edge of her coat, and the carefully constructed narrative she had maintained for days faltered. It wasn't supposed to happen like that," she murmured, her voice barely audible. I just wanted to be seen, to matter. Ewan, he humiliated me too many times. And Donald, he got in the way." Hamish's calm presence, the careful accumulation of evidence and observation, left her no room to maneuver. She had reacted exactly as he had predicted, under pressure, in the familiar environment. Confronted with a pattern she had thought invisible, her psychology betrayed her. "I understand," Hamish said quietly. "But you must understand that the law will deal with what you've done. This is the moment to be honest, before anyone else is put in danger." Morag's eyes glistened with unshed tears, the weight of her obsession and its consequences finally overwhelming the carefully curated control she had maintained. She swallowed hard, then spoke, the confession spilling out in a rush. "I planned it, the note, the Holly, everything. I wanted him to see, to feel the same power I'd been denied. Donald, he tried to stop me, and I didn't mean for him to disappear, but I couldn't let him interfere." Hamish nodded, noting the precise mixture of guilt, rationalization, and residual obsession. He reached for his notebook to record the confession, while keeping one eye on the vestry door, ever alert to any sudden movement. The trap had worked. Not through force, not through confrontation, but through patience, observation, and a subtle pressure that exposed the truth without risk. Outside, the wind shifted, and the first hint of night deepened. Morag Grant, finally unmasked, was led away by the constables, the weight of her actions pressing visibly upon her shoulders. Hamish watched her go, breathing slowly, knowing that the case, long tangled with past grievances, psychological complexity, and careful manipulation, was finally at its conclusion. Yet he remained vigilant as always in Loch Dhu. The quiet streets held secrets, but for tonight at least, justice had quietly returned. Hamish Macbeth stood outside the vestry, watching Morag Grant being escorted down the snowy lane, the constable's boots crunching in rhythm with hers. The village seemed to exhale, the tension of the past days dissipating into the cold night air. The holly sprig, symbolic and vanished, had played its part. The pattern had been unravelled, the motive revealed, and the confession obtained. Yet even as relief brushed his mind, a subtle unease crept in, an instinctive whisper that told him the story was not yet complete. He returned to his office, boots leaving wet impressions on the threshold, and began reviewing the details one LA. Some time. Each step of the sequence, each reaction he had observed, seemed coherent, almost too neat. Morag's confession had matched his deductions, but Hamish had learned long ago that human nature was rarely so tidy. Something gnawed at him, a faint inconsistency, a detail he had dismissed earlier. The note, the holly, the careful manipulation, all tied to Morag, but the missing boots, the smudge on Donald MacLeod's floorboards, the brief figure he had glimpsed slipping down the alley the night of the vanishing, those elements did not quite fit her timeline. Someone else had moved in those shadows, someone patient, someone who had observed Hamish himself. The idea was uncomfortable, but the instincts that had guided him for years would not be ignored. Hamish retraced the streets mentally, reconstructing every movement of suspects and witnesses. Then it clicked. The casual way Father Angus had suggested an early resolution to the investigation. The almost imperceptible hesitation when Hamish mentioned the holly's placement, and the slight but deliberate redirection of questions when Morag had reacted. Small things, each easily overlooked, yet cumulatively pointing to another hand in the unfolding drama. E moved quickly back to the church, scanning the shadows in the dim lamplight. His eyes fell on the vestry door, still faintly ajar. Something subtle caught his attention, a folded scrap of paper partially tucked beneath the threshold. Kneeling, he retrieved it, careful not to disturb anything else. It was a second note, older, written in a hand different from Morag's. The message was chillingly simple. He sees too much. Control is not enough. Finish it, Hamish's pulse quickened. Morag had been a participant, yes, but she had not acted alone. Someone had orchestrated, manipulated, and anticipated her moves, nudging events and ensuring the chaos unfolded in a particular way. The mastermind had hidden in plain sight, perhaps even among the very people who had feigned cooperation with the investigation. And the final, crucial move, the vanishing boots, Donald's disappearance, had been the work of this unseen hand. He considered Father Angus again, the man whose composure had seemed so sincere, whose hesitancy had seemed minor, but now, under the weight of this revelation, appeared strategically calculated. The old priest had access, authority, and knowledge of the village's rhythms, and he had been present at critical moments without raising suspicion. A thought struck Hamish sharply. Someone had been pulling strings behind the facade of piety, using Morag's obsession as a proxy for action, testing the limits of observation and remaining invisible until now. Hamish's mind raced as he reconstructed the timeline with this new perspective. The note to Ewan, the holly, the manipulated reactions, the missing boots, and the disappearance of Donald, all orchestrated with precision, but with one invisible puppeteer orchestrating the broader arc. Morag had been the agent, the visible force, but the strategy, the unseen influence, the orchestration of chaos, pointed to a deeper, colder intelligence. A movement behind the altar made him freeze. He stepped silently, hand on his coat pocket where his notebook rested, and there, in the dim shadow of the church, he glimpsed a figure slipping quietly toward the vestry exit. Without a sound, Hamish pursued, boots muted by the old carpets, heart steady. He cornered the figure against the wall, a man whose face, now illuminated by a shaft of light, confirmed his worst suspicion. Father Angus stood there, calm, almost serene, but his eyes betrayed calculation, experience, and the unsettling precision of someone who had orchestrated events without a trace until now. Hamish's pulse slowed, focus sharpening. The final confrontation was not over. Morag had confessed, yes, but the real mastermind remained, patient, clever, and willing to test him to the limit. "You underestimated what people are capable of hiding," Hamish said softly, letting his words fill the narrow space, calm but unmistakable. "And I underestimated nothing." Father Angus smiled faintly, the serene mask slipping just enough to reveal the predator beneath. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "but even the most careful observer can be led astray." Hamish's mind raced, every observation, every reaction, every clue from the past days converging into strategy. This was the last twist, the final challenge, and in the shadowed silence of the vestry, the battle of wits between detective and master manipulator began anew. The village might have thought the case closed, but Hamish knew better. The game was far from over, and the truth, cold, calculating, and unexpected, was finally stepping from the shadows. Hamish Macbeth kept Father Angus in sight, stepping slowly to close the distance, every movement deliberate. The old priest's calmness unnerved him. He had underestimated this quiet control, the way a single, unassuming man could orchestrate chaos while appearing pious and harmless. The vestry walls seemed to press closer as Hamish considered the web of deception. Morag had acted under direction, manipulated by someone whose reach extended beyond her obsession, someone who had orchestrated the missing Holly, Donald MacLeod's disappearance, and even the staged clues meant to mislead the villagers and the authorities. "You've been careful," Hamish said evenly, eyes fixed on Father Angus. "You've manipulated the narrative, guided Morag, and remained unseen while the village chased shadows. But there's a reason the Holly, the note, and Donald's disappearance all fit together, and it points to you." Arthur Angus's expression remained. Ed serene, but his hands betrayed a subtle tension. "Do you think I acted alone? Do you think I required more than one willing participant?" he asked, voice soft, almost conversational, yet laced with implication. Hamish nodded slowly. "No. Morag was the visible hand, the one who acted. But you orchestrated, observed, predicted. Every hesitation, every redirection, every tiny slip that seemed insignificant. It was all yours. The smudge on Donald's floorboards, the vanished boots, the subtle misdirection with the Holly, those were not random. And you miscalculated one thing. Human psychology doesn't stay hidden forever." The old priest's lips twitched, as if suppressing a smile or a sigh. "Perhaps I underestimated you, Hamish Macbeth," he admitted quietly. "The village never suspected, and even Morag thought herself in control at times. Yet here you are, piecing it together." Hamish stepped closer, voice steady. "You tested patience, timing, and observation. But no one can hide forever. The pattern, the psychological fingerprints, the deliberate orchestration, led to you. Each small clue was part of a larger puzzle, a pattern only visible when connected. The boy's offhand comment about seeing someone placing the Holly, the slight hesitation when the sprig was mentioned, the subtle inconsistencies in Morag's timeline, the way Donald's disappearance was staged, all of it made sense in the end. You wanted control, yes, but you left pieces of yourself everywhere." Father Angus's gaze flicked toward the vestry door, calculating, considering escape. "You cannot trap what you cannot see," he said softly, his voice smooth. "And I am never entirely trapped." Hamish recognized the edge in the old man's tone. He moved quickly, closing off the aisle and signaling the constables waiting outside. The priest's eyes narrowed, realizing his exit routes were anticipated. Yet even as he was estranged, Hamish felt the familiar disquiet of unfinished business, the unsettling certainty that while justice would be delivered tonight, the mind behind the crimes would continue to think, plan, and perhaps manipulate from confinement. "The truth is always in the details," Hamish said, almost to himself, as he watched the constables guide Father Angus away. The Holly sprig, the note, Donald's boots, even the subtle reactions of those around him, they all mattered. Most overlooked them, dismissed them as trivial or coincidental, but they were never accidental. They were deliberate, calculated, and revealing. He paused, surveying the empty vestry. The weight of the village's quiet settled around him, the streets outside dark and slick with slush. Morag would face the consequences of her actions. Father Angus would be confined, but the unsettling sense of unease remained. A mind that had orchestrated events with such precision could adapt, plan, and find new opportunities even behind walls. Hamish's lips pressed into a thin line. Justice had been served, yes, yet the complexity of human obsession and cleverness left a lingering shadow. The case, now fully revealed, was a testament to observation, patience, and the capacity to see patterns others missed. He had been one step ahead, but he knew the truth about Loch Dhu. Quiet streets and familiar faces could hide secrets deeper than anyone imagined. The night was still, but for Hamish Macbeth, the vigilance that had guided him through tangled motives, vanished clues, and unseen masterminds remained as essential as ever. And as he stepped out into the darkened village, boots crunching in the slush, He allowed himself a brief, measured exhale. Justice had been delivered, but the shadows of human cunning, he knew, would always linger just beyond the lamplit streets. Hamish Macbeth stepped out into the crisp Lochdu night, the slushy streets reflecting the faint glow of lamplights like liquid silver. The case that had consumed the village for weeks now seemed resolved. Morag Grant in custody, Father Angus confined, the web of deception unravelled. Yet even as he walked, the usual satisfaction of a solved mystery was tempered by a persistent, nagging sense of incompleteness. Something subtle lingered, a fragment that didn't quite fit, a detail that refused to settle into the tidy narrative. He wandered toward the edge of the village, boots crunching in rhythm with the soft drip of melting snow. The wind carried the faint scent of pine and smoke, familiar and comforting, yet underlaid with the faintest trace of something else. An element out of place, barely perceptible, but unmistakable to a trained eye and mind. It reminded him of the holly sprig, of small details that had revealed so much before, and he realized that even in apparent resolution, the world never fully surrendered its secrets. The vanished boots of Donald MacLeod, the way the note had been phrased, the subtle hesitations, the carefully hidden psychological manipulations, each had been accounted for, explained, and traced back to the orchestrators. Yet as he passed the church, the old vestry door seemed to catch his attention differently, a shadow lingering longer than it should, or perhaps a shift in the snow outside that didn't match any footprints he could recall. He paused, crouched slightly, and observed. Nothing obvious, no one, no evidence, but the instinct persisted. Hamish let out a low whistle, more to himself than anyone else. Even when patterns were deciphered and motives revealed, mysteries had a way of leaving threads untied. There was always something beyond the apparent, a hidden layer just beneath the surface, waiting to be noticed by the careful observer. He had learned long ago that true resolution was never final. It was merely a momentary alignment of chaos into clarity, temporary and fragile. As he continued along the village lane, he thought of the notes, the messages, and the orchestrated gestures, and then, almost imperceptibly, his mind returned to the scrap of paper he had found beneath the vestry threshold. The second note, the one written in a different hand. He sees too much. Control is not enough. Finish it. Hamish had interpreted it as evidence of Father Angus's manipulations, yet a deeper reading nagged at him. The phrasing suggested someone else entirely, someone who had been carefully watching the unfolding events, perhaps guiding them from the periphery, someone who had ensured the chain of actions followed exactly as intended. The thought made him pause mid-step, eyes narrowing against the cold wind. Even as justice had been delivered, the possibility of a hidden observer remained, someone patient and intelligent enough to remain undetected, waiting for the next opportunity. The village had slept uneasily while he pursued one set of orchestrations. Perhaps another was just beginning, subtle, deliberate, and hidden in plain sight. Hamish shook his head slightly, a wry smile tugging at his lips. Lochdu would sleep tonight, the streets quiet, the lamps flickering. Yet for him, the investigation never truly ended. Each case left a residue of questions, a trace of uncertainty, a tiny clue pointing toward the next puzzle. Some mysteries were solved, others merely paused, their answers waiting for the right observer to notice the pattern. He glanced toward the hills beyond the village, their dark silhouettes etched against the faint shimmer of stars, and felt the familiar stir of anticipation. Even in triumph, the work of a detective was never complete. The streets, the shadows, and the people of Lochdu would continue to offer whispers of secrets and hints of intrigue, and Hamish Macbeth, ever observant, would be there to catch them. With a final glance at the silent church, the lamplit streets, and the dark hills beyond, he stepped onward, boots leaving wet impressions in the slush. Justice had been served, yet the hint of another puzzle lingered in the air, a whisper carried on the wind. And as he walked, he knew that in Lochdu, a mystery never truly ended. It only evolved, waiting patiently for its next observer, its next unfolding, and its next revelation.